colleagues, a warm welcome from me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Helen Martin, one of the directors of the Gateway Alliance, but it's lovely to see you today. And as I've just said, really thank you for joining us. We understand that this is a tricky week in terms of your busy lives within school, in a tricky term, in a tricky year. So thank you so much for giving up your time, and I really hope that you have a valuable, hour and 3/4 with us this afternoon in terms of this session. We are obviously continuing to meet online, and sadly that's the news for the rest of the year, that in terms of the uncertainty around restrictions, that there's been an agreement that the whole of our programme will be online until the end of this academic year. So we are sort of starting to get used to this, but we know that it's not ideal, and particularly in terms of developing the networking part of these sessions is very, very tricky. But we are really keen to engage you, help to move your practice forward, and provide you opportunities to be able to engage in the session as much as possible today. So really, I hope you're able to do that. As I say, please put your videos on if you can. Don't worry about your backgrounds. Please keep your microphones muted if you can, because that will help in terms of background noise. But it's wonderful for me and for Ben to be able to see some faces, as obviously Ben's leading the session today, in terms of some participant engagement. And so we can see you nodding and smiling and engaging. That's absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much if you can have your videos on. That's absolutely brilliant. In terms of Zoom, hopefully you're quite familiar with Zoom, but there's a chat function. So if you click on chat, you can type in comments and questions. I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the session. So if there's anything that I'll interject and share that with Ben if he's not been able to see that. And obviously, if you've got any problems with your camera or your microphone, you want to share that with me, please do let me know, and I'll see if I can help in any way. In terms of today then, so obviously the theme, and this is a two-part course really this term. So we've got today and we've got next Wednesday the 17th, which is the follow-up part of this session, where we're looking at essential physical development and promoting that across early years. Really delighted to welcome Ben Kingston-Hughes to lead the session for us today. I know some of you will know Ben because I know he's done some work across Warwickshire with some of the aspiration networks previously. So I'm delighted to welcome Ben. He's got a huge amount of knowledge and expertise in terms of early years through his company, his training company, Inspired Children, working with schools and supporting colleagues, developing a whole range of different aspects of early years practice. But we're focusing on physical development today and hoping that it'll be pertinent for you in terms of welcoming all of your children back into school, and we'll be thinking about that in a little bit more detail as well. So we're here until 5:30. I'm going to hand over to Ben so we can use every moment, but I hope you do get a lot out of the session anyway, colleagues, and a warm welcome anyway. Thanks, Ben.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's nice of Helen to say that I've got a lot of knowledge. That may have been true a few months ago, but I've been homeschooling my own children now. So a lot of that knowledge is now gone and been replaced with grammar and all of the countries of Africa, which is what my daughter's been doing. So in case you don't know me, my name is Ben. I've worked with children now for over 30 years, at which point you're supposed to say, oh, you don't look old enough. But since homeschooling my children, I have literally aged 50 years overnight. I am struggling with grammar, I have to say. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm a writer. I get paid to write articles. And even I didn't know half the stuff that they're trying to teach my 9-year-old. And I can't help thinking that if I don't know it, it's perhaps not the right age to be boring my daughter to death with it. And I genuinely think we shouldn't be doing stuff like grammar until much older, 30, perhaps 40, because my daughter was bored out of her mind. And at no point did they say that language is fun, that language is full of imagination and creativity, all the bits we should be teaching our children. So I don't want to go on about that today because that's not today's course, but I am exhausted, as I'm sure many of you are. The new technology is a bit of a challenge, so it is lovely that I can see your faces. I did a course 2 weeks ago where everybody had their camera off, and after 2 hours I actually felt like I'd gone mad because there would be no difference, just me sitting in my shed talking to myself. So literally no difference at all. So thank you for that. There have been a few teething troubles. One of the early ones was that my glasses were reflecting so much that it was really distracting for people. So I very cleverly glued bits of plastic onto my glasses, which I don't know if you can see that there. And that actually stops them, angles them downwards, So the lights don't shine on them, which is genius if you think about it. Although, unfortunately, the next bit isn't, because unfortunately the glue wasn't dry when I first tried them out. So my very first training session with my new glasses, I stuck them to my face, and midway through had that awkward realization where I literally couldn't move them and had to rip two big chunks of hair out of the side of my head. So it has been a bit of an issue, but my main role is not actually this training bit. It's working with vulnerable children. The training that I do tends to subsidize the sessions that we do with some of our most vulnerable children. So I work with children who've been through extreme trauma, with children that have been through abuse and bereavement, children with behavioral problems, children, disabled children, families. We don't specify what the vulnerability is. We just help those children. And we don't have a therapeutic remit. We never go in to actually heal those children. What we do is try to give them their childhood back again. And it's the moments of play where all of this seems to click into place. It's the really silly stuff. It's not the complex therapeutic stuff, which we do. And we do work with play therapists and art therapists and all range of psychologists and counsellors. It's actually sitting there making a den with a child when you see them smile for the first time, or making a magic potion with them. It's those moments that time and time again for 30 years have had the most impact. And one of the things we've seen the most joy in is simply children moving. But this is a long way from children moving in a sports class. Children moving in a all line up, let's see who's the fastest type of way. And people watching this will probably, some of you have those negative experiences of PE. My wife has been helping my son, a teenager, with his schoolwork whilst doing homeschooling. And she said, well, I'm not doing PE. So I've had to write her a note to get out of virtual PE with my son, because she's got such bad memories of PE teachers being mean and making her disengage in that. And that's really important. So we're not looking at physical activity today from a let's all line up and do stuff. We're looking at that freedom of movement, that joyful movement, and those essential movements that every child needs to do to reach their full potential. So I'm going to start with just a really, really quick story. And if you've had training with me before, I apologize if you've heard this one before, but it's so relevant for today that I thought I had to share this with you. I don't know if there's any head teachers watching this. If there are, you don't have to identify yourself. But I did have a very, very weird conversation with a head teacher last year. And in fact, probably the weirdest thing a head teacher's ever said to me. So I was going to train her staff, but I wasn't training classroom staff on this occasion. I was actually going in to work with lunchtime staff, because school lunchtimes in some schools have kind of degenerated to become 45 minutes of adults telling children what not to do. And there are still some really good ones out there, but there's quite a few. And in fact, I've recently had to write a whole string of emails to a head teacher because they've banned handstands and cartwheels in the school. And if you unpick just how valuable handstands and cartwheels are for children, you'd realise why I'm sending these emails. But it's not just that. There's a school in Leicestershire, which I'm in Leicestershire at the moment, that's banned running at playtime. Not running with chainsaws or running with scissors. I mean, just running. But the funniest is a school in Staffordshire, which I won't name and shame, but they banned daisy chain making. The head teacher genuinely believed that a dog would have snuck in the night. Where this dog's coming from, I don't know. Weed on the daisies, and the children would get germs. And it's worth bearing in mind, the statistics on this, because millions of children die every year from daisy chain related death. And if you could spare just £2 a month to save those poor children. So anyway, my job is to go in and get lunchtime staff to roll down hills with children, to join in and to play and to support play rather than standing still blowing whistles at them. And I went to talk to this head before I'd met her staff, and she said, now I'm going to be honest with you, one of my staff is actually evil. And I thought she was joking, but she wasn't. She was absolutely dead serious that one of her staff wasn't just like slightly bad, but was actually evil. She then said, if you could observe this member of staff and get me some evidence so I can get them out on a disciplinary, that'd be really helpful. So my remit is no longer to teach her staff, but to get them the sack, which is a really uncomfortable position to be in. So I walk into this training room, and there's a man in the corner of the room who is the most morbidly obese man you've ever seen in your life. I've never worked with anybody this big in my life. And he turned and looked at me and he went, they call me Mr. Grumpy because I'm the worst member of staff in the school. He was actually proud that all the children hated him. And his job, he thought, was to sit at a bench, because he wouldn't move, and blowing whistles at children, telling them off for the whole lunchtime. And so the kids hated him. The trouble is, I couldn't get any evidence on him, Because after session 1, where we looked at the neurological benefits of play, this guy got it. Something clicked in his brain and he became fanatical about helping children. It was the most incredible transformation. The trouble is that session 2 was all about physical activity, and it's some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. But if this was a live practical session, I've got a lot of games that they don't focus on the winning and the losing. They can still be competitive. I'm not getting rid of that completely, but what I'm saying is it's about joy. Unfortunately for you guys, or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint, I can't do those over the screen today. So you've either escaped or you've missed out. But one of the games I was going to play with you, if this was live, we've nicknamed the Dinner Lady Killer, because it is so full on in terms of exercise, but you don't even realize you're doing the exercise. And this guy joined in for 2 hours. He did not stop running for 2 hours because for the first time in his life, nobody cared how fast he was. Nobody cared how strong he was, how good he was. And all right, in fairness, after 2 hours, he did nearly die. But see, that's strange because some groups I do that, everyone looks quite concerned about him. Everyone says, oh, the poor chap. I'm looking at a row of people laughing at the poor man here. Oh, was he sweaty? Yes, he was, very. When he could breathe again, he said he was an overweight child picked on by adults and made to disengage. And we forget this. We forget that that is permanent in many children. For the rest of his life, he never did enough exercise ever again because of how he'd been made to feel in primary school. Well, the next day he went out into the playground and started doing these games with the children. And that's when something amazing happened. More children joined in with him than had ever joined in with the young, fit sports coach that the school had just hired to combat obesity. And I don't know if your schools and settings have got these guys, because you clone them. They buy them from Argos. They're like a big blister pack full of sports coaches. And they're all kind of fit and handsome and young and muscly in their tracksuits. I'm not bitter, but I'm 50 with dodgy knees. And these guys have got the whole life ahead of them. But I haven't seen the pictures. I can only see a few. I bet there's a guy in a tracksuit going, how very dare he? The point is, this guy had no children around him. Not one. While over 60 children swarmed the massively overweight man. Because for the first time in school history, the children could catch the adult in a catching game. And he didn't care. Big grin on his face, sweat everywhere. He had the best lunchtime of his life. And as an added bonus, multiple children could catch him at once. He was the most powerful role model in the whole school for combating obesity, despite being obese himself. Because he was showing every single child there, wow, if he can do it, I can do it. And sometimes in terms of not just physical activity, but in every aspect of development, children don't always need to see us being brilliant. The competent adult is a positive role model. Confident children will look at that role model and go, wow, one day I'll be big, I'll be able to do that. But you're not working with confident children. A significant number of your children will be struggling and they need to see us getting it wrong. They need to see us falling over, wiping the mud from our eyes and just showing them it's okay to be human. It's okay to be a child and it's okay to get it wrong. And I think in terms of physical activity, if you're not the most physically active person in a setting or a school, you're the perfect person to be dancing around like a mad person, to be jumping off things and to be falling over and just being silly. If you can't do a cartwheel to save your life, you're the perfect person to be teaching children how to do cartwheels. Because when you get it wrong, they will giggle and they will try it. Get it wrong or right, they're still enjoying movement. So I hope that makes sense. I have got a few practical things for you today, but nothing major. But you don't have to join in. The one thing I'm really cautious about on my training is that because I work with vulnerable children, I would never force them to do stuff that they're not comfortable with. So I'm not going to be a hypocrite and make you do stuff. And if anybody's ever been on my training, you'll know that I never do things like, oh, let's go around the room and say our names and say a bit about ourselves and what you hope to gain from it. I hate stuff like that. It's like a circle of death for me, because by the time it gets to my turn, I'm so anxious, I don't know my own name by the time it gets to that point. So nobody's going to force you to do anything. But I've hopefully, with the overweight man story, given you a little bit of guilt, so you will try and join in at least a little bit. If you don't join in today, that's fine. But remember, with your children, more than any other time, they need us to be a different sort of grown-up, the kind of grown-up that joins in. So I'm going to start you off with something really simple, but this is perhaps the most neurologically rich thing we're going to do today. Only you won't know it when I tell you it, because we're going to do pat a cake. That's all we're going to do. But I'd like you to try and do it to the screen. And I promise you, once we've done it, I will show you just how neurologically rich what we've done is. So I'm going to get you to copy me. Really simple pat a cake routine, because I'm not very good at stuff like this. But we're going to do a clap and then a pat to the screen. And I would like if sort of partners and husbands and people walking past go, what's going on there? Although not what happened to me 3 weeks ago when somebody's husband walked naked past the doorway after having a shower. And that was a bit of a double take moment. He was carrying the towel, wasn't covering anything, but he was carrying. A lady there's just checked to make sure. So we're going to do simple paticate, which is clap and pat to the screen, then clap and right hand, clap and left hand, and then clap. And that's all it is. It's just cycling the same one. So very simple. So copy me and see how many of you can try and do this. So clap, pat, clap, right, clap, left, 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 clap, clap. You're better than me. That's not fair. Some of you are going so fast, all I can see is trails of people's hands as it's the time delay. Thank you so much for doing that. I appreciate it. It's lovely to see people actually joining in, and it's so nice not to have a blank screen to talk to. So why is that neurologically rich? Because I guarantee no setting or whatever is looking out the window and seeing children doing that and going, wow, look at the neurological development there. And that's a real problem. It's actually one of the hardest things about my job, because I'm a play specialist. I'm currently writing a book on play. I teach about play. I slip play into every single training course I do, but nobody values it. The amount of conversations I've had with head teachers, for instance, where it's so secondary to the proper learning, the academic stuff, the maths and the literacy and all that. And I'm hoping by the end of these courses that you'll see that they're not separate at all. They're intrinsically linked. And by doing paticate, just then, you are activating what we call a neural network in your brain. And that's a phrase that's brilliant to remember, neural networks. It's a great one for when your parents argue with you. If they say, why is my child out in the mud doing messy play? I want him doing his phonics. You can say, well, because he's 3 months old. No, you can say he's building neural networks, because that's exactly what sensory and messy play does. It builds huge parts of your brain. So by clapping, we're controlling each of our hands with a different side of our brain. Both sides of our body, all our limbs, legs, arms, whatever, are controlled by a different side of your brain. So already, by coordinating and doing a simple clap, we're actually using two sides of the brain. And brain growth is experiential. That's the first key to today. You have to do stuff with your brain to grow it. And it is a use it or lose it scenario. So we have to be really careful in early childhood to make sure enough of that child's brain is activated. So two sides of the brain working simultaneously. That's starting to build a neural network in the brain. Now, interestingly, a lot of the early physical movements that children do overlap the same neural networks for other things: reading and writing, mathematics, problem solving. Problem solving requires a neural network. Lots of parts of the brain used at once. And I mean just simple problem solving, although that is, stealing a biscuit, simple problem solving. Right up to Einstein, solving the problems of the universe requires a neural network. And when you use these neural networks using both sides of your brain at once, the two halves of your brain have to talk to each other. And they do that by a really innocent, tiny little bit of your brain called your corpus callosum or corpus callosum. There are other ways to pass messages, but that's the most significant. The corpus callosum, simple nerves passing messages left to right. But it's so important, because for all of those neural networks to work at their full capacity, you need a well-developed corpus callosum. And remember, you have to use a part of the brain to build it. So how do you build that corpus callosum that is ultimately going to lead to problem solving? You do it by paticate, through disco dancing, through running around, through bouncing off walls, through climbing and jumping, everything where you're coordinating your body, you're controlling the limbs using both sides of your brain at once. It is the most significant way in which we build that part of the brain. Simple movements from a baby, rocking and trying to crawl, right up to complex paticake in the playground with a group of year sixes. Yeah? So clapping. First time a baby claps, that's neurologically off the scale. Quick question for you though. How does a baby learn to clap in the first place? And you can answer this in the chat, and don't worry if you don't want to, but there's no wrong answers here, but how does a baby learn to clap? Anybody? I'll give you a few seconds to answer, and honestly, you don't have to. Modeling, perfect. Yeah. So a baby learns to clap by copying. It's simple as that. One of the things that we know is that peer group, so the other children in your room, in your setting, in your school, they are a lot less significant than the adults for this. So somebody's mentioned the parent. Yes, it's the significant adult that is going to influence that child more. Yeah. Does anybody work with very young children? I don't know what the age group that you guys are. If anybody works with kind of under ones, you might know a slightly different answer to this, because there is a shortcut that parents and early years workers will do with the child to get them to clap. It's not just copying. Quite often we will physically grab, move their hands, spot on, Joe. Quite often we will grab the baby's hands and make them clap. Now, it sounds like child abuse, but it isn't. It's actually a wonderful moment of what we call attunement play. It's face to face. It's that whole nurturing, because you're not doing it silently, are you? You're making noises. You're going, oh, do boo boo boo, oh, boo boo boo. Has anybody here worked with young children and then forgotten to turn that voice off when they get back to home? Because I've done that before, working in baby rooms, and go, hello, darling, what have you done today at work? And then realise I'm talking to my wife like that. The point is that we make it fun, we make it nurturing, we make it joyful, and because of that, it's off the scale in terms of what that's doing to the brain. Activating communication language centers before the child can even speak, activating their mathematical sequencing before they can even have that concept of maths, before those bits of the brain are even fully formed. Simply clapping, grabbing a child's hands and interacting with them. Now, the problem here is that a television screen cannot grab a child's hands and make them clap. It's as simple as that. All of the benefits that we're talking about today have to be real adults with real children. It doesn't work through a screen. And you're probably aware of this, but it bears repeating. The average screen time for a child in this country is now 7 hours a day plus. And that was pre-lockdown. So we don't know at all what the statistics are going to be for lockdown, but it's huge. And that, whether you want to get, I'm not going to get into the whole whether screens are bad, whether screens are good. There's so many studies out there and some of them contradict each other. But for every hour you're on a screen is an hour you're missing out on the stuff that is really important. So it's about balance today. I'm not going to say get rid of all screens for children, because they are a vital tool that they're going to be needing to use in later life. However, in terms of building the brain, they are a fraction of the potential of simple early childhood movement. Okay, so I hope that makes sense so far. I'm going to start to unpick movement now and what it really means to our children. And I'm going to ask you a very simple question. But before I do that, I'm going to turn on a presentation, because I didn't think that looking at my face for 2 hours would be good for some people. So hopefully I'll be able to superimpose myself over this presentation. But you will have to bear with me for 30 seconds while I do this, because it sometimes takes time. Yeah, it just takes the time to watch. So hopefully, can you give me a wave if you can see a bunch of children running and me superimposed over that? Brilliant. If you can't see that, if you can see me as a separate screen, it might mean that you've not updated to the latest version of Zoom, because this is a new function on Zoom. Another new function is the ability to give yourself makeup. If anybody's interested in that one, you can give yourself lipstick and eyeshadow. And I'm guessing most of you have seen the clip on YouTube of the lawyer who turned up at a law hearing as a cat. The funniest thing about that isn't the fact that he looks like a cat. It's that he had to actually qualify the fact by saying, I'm not a cat, as if everybody else was thinking an actual kitten had turned up and was leading the Zoom meeting. Anyway, hopefully you can all see that now. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I would like answers in the comments if you can. Again, not a trick question. Okay, so I'm sure you've discussed this at meetings. I'm sure you all know this, because it's become really big. Actually, they've changed the rules on keeping free-range chickens. So I thought I ought to spend this time just bringing this up now. So does anybody know what the newish rules on free-range chickens are? And I'm expecting you all to know, because I mean this is as important as the new EYFS, obviously. And you'll have had emergency meetings about this. And how do we keep our chickens? You can't let yeah. I'm hoping that says you can't let them out the coop, not you can't let them out the co-op, because if they're in the co-op, it's probably too late for the chicken. So genuinely, although I was being silly, genuinely they have changed the rules on chicken keeping. And this is quite significant, because the reason they've changed the rules on chicken keeping is because they've done loads of studies on chicken welfare. Because it turns out that chickens are a huge multi-billion-pound industry. So it is important that our chickens live longer to lay more eggs. So they've done all these studies on chicken well-being. How you interview a chicken about their well-being, I don't know. It's, how are you feeling right now? Are you feeling a bit cooped up in your... I don't know if that's how they do it. But genuinely, this is what you have to do. According to the newish, about 2 or 3 years old, European regulations, free-range chickens have to spend a third of their lives outdoors. because it is intrinsically detrimental to their life expectancy and well-being if they don't. Each chicken must have 4 meters squared of outdoor space to move freely in, because anything smaller is detrimental to their emotional well-being and their health. And then chickens must have free access to that space during daylight hours. They have to be allowed to access outdoors and space to move around in I don't know what you'd call that. I suppose free flow for chickens. And then this is one of the new ones. You can't just have chickens on gravel. Outdoor space must have largely grass or other similar vegetation underfoot, because having gravel or concrete underfoot for chickens is considered detrimental to their well-being. And now I'm sure you can see where this is going, but it is worth putting this in perspective. A chicken, by law, in order to be categorized as a free-range chicken, needs at least 4 meters squared to run around in, to have that physical exercise, because if it doesn't, it dies sooner. Yeah? And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, 4 meters squared is quite a small area. Yeah? So let's put it into perspective. I'm going to compare that with something else. So let's compare it to, I don't know what, a child. Randomly, let's pick a child. If you use the same weight and height measurements but compared the equivalent space for a child, every child that we work with legally should require 56 meters squared of space to be able to run around in anytime they want to, day or night. Because in chickens, that affects their life expectancy. Now, we all know this is not the case. And in fact, we're now looking at a situation where some of our children that we work with don't even fulfill the criteria for free-range chickens. They would not be categorized as free-range. But some of our children, the ones that go home and literally stay in one room right up to bedtime, then go to bed, they don't even fulfill the rules for the old battery farming chickens. They would be the equivalent of battery children. And it would be illegal now to sell their eggs in this country. Now, obviously, if your children lay eggs, that's a whole different issue. So let's not get bogged down with that. The point is that what we have is a system that protects our chickens more than it does our children. And I learned this recently. It's not just chickens. There's been a whole raft of studies on prisoner welfare, even in secure prisons. And these similar rules protect prisoners. Prisoners have a mandatory amount of exercise every day. They have to be physically active, because without it, it's considered in breach of their fundamental human rights. No such legislation protects children. And it is a horrible situation for us to be in. And in fact, A World Without Play, which was in 2011, and I will explain to you later on just how much worse things have got since this document came out. And even in this document, the panel recognised this tragic irony that there is more legislation protecting chickens for exercise and outdoor time than there is for children. And they also identified a term that you've all heard of, because it's a big one at the moment, but bucket babies. That this is one of the initial documents that identified that emerging term. And bucket babies are babies that go from high chair to baby seat to baby nest. The car seat gets carried to the car, clips in, which I thought was amazing, because my son didn't have one, and you had to get them out, and that took ages. And then when my daughter came along, clip, brilliant for parenting, not so good for the child. And what we have is excessive sedentary behavior in babies that will affect them potentially for the rest of their lives if we don't address it in early years. And for babies that are sedentary for huge amounts of the day, it is critical for their brain growth, because all of that stuff we talked about, that tiny little brain, that tiny bit of the brain called the corpus callosum, that is the tip of the iceberg in terms of the brain development caused by movement. And even that will underpin problem solving, basically from stealing biscuits to Einstein, but it will underpin all sorts of other things that you do as well. So it's worth bearing in mind at this stage that each of my eyes is attached to a different side of my brain, which means that they're controlled by two hemispheres. So if I want to see clearly, my corpus callosum has to help pass those messages from left to right. So when I scan from left to right, which looked a bit weird on the screen, but when I do, I'm effectively going from dominant one side of my brain to dominant the other. So when I reach the middle and I'm looking straight down the camera, I'm in equilibrium. Corpus callosum functioning, I can see clearly. If my corpus callosum is not functioning properly, I will not. And in fact, I've worked just before lockdown with a child who had brain damage of the corpus callosum, and he would see double overlaying images from his eyes. He could not combine them into one image. Now, why is it important that our children can look from left to right seamlessly? The basics of reading. You can do all the phonics in the world, all the cue cards, all the shape recognition. If the child can't see what's on the page when they look at it, they're going to struggle. And this is one of the biggest mistakes people make about dyslexia. They think it's a child who can't read. For some children, it's that the letters on the page won't stand still long enough for them to be able to read. Now, my son's dyslexic, and it's made him struggle in almost everything else, because from Key Stage 1, everything's given written. Everything. So he's now maths phobic, not because he's bad at maths, because the maths was given written, and although he can read, he's slower. He's an incredibly intelligent, imaginative child. And you guys secretly know that that means weird, don't you? But he is. And yet he believes he's stupid. He genuinely believes he's stupid because he's slightly slower at reading. Anyway, the point is that the corpus callosum is not the major cause of dyslexia. I do need to stress that. There's all sorts of different causes for dyslexia. We don't fully understand some of them, but it's a tiny part of the brain built through early movements, through clapping, through jumping, through disco dancing, that ultimately leads to reading, writing, mathematics, problem solving. And Einstein, when he died, donated his brain to science. And what did they find when they chopped it open? Well, I hope he was dead. A hugely well-developed corpus callosum. Massive. And this is a guy who solved the entire universe. Okay? So, you're all looking at me in stunned silence, so I better move on quickly. I've got another question. Seeing children with flat head syndrome. Sorry, I'd just seen a comment from Sarah. Yeah, I work with children who've been passed over for adoption, and we noticed an example of this, and it was actually with a social worker. With a foster carer. So this child had been taken from an abusive parent, and then the foster carer was causing so little physical movement that the flat head syndrome, and it is increasing. My son did once try to break a plastic guitar on his sister's head during an argument. So that's a different reason. No, moving on. So I've got another question for you. This one underpins everything that your children ever do, and it's really simple. Why do children skip? That's all it is. So any answers, anything you want to write down, there's no wrong answers to this, but why do children skip? It's fun to skip. They enjoy it because they're happy. Yeah, absolutely spot on. Joy. Yeah, we're going to come back to joy. Joy is so important for our children right now. I cannot stress. Whole body movements, big movements. Yeah, big body movements. All of these are absolutely essential. What we do, though, what we find when we unpick skipping is that the fun, the joy, the wonderful feelings that you get from it are not the cause of the behaviour. They're actually the symptom of the behaviour. And somebody's just said that it's efficient. And actually what I'm going to show you is it's the opposite of efficient. Because if you look at children's movement development from a developmental or even evolutionary perspective, you think of a baby who can't move. According to evolution, any organism that is vulnerable needs to do something about that to stop them being vulnerable. So the drive to get a child from baby just barely able to move to get them walking is so powerful. It's one of the most powerful drives. You'll see babies doing everything from, that first rocking to get their balance, to reaching, to stretching, to crawling, to pulling themselves up, to shuffling on their bottom, but they're going in one direction. They want to walk, because once you can walk, you're less vulnerable. You've nailed the very first part of two-legged human movement, and that's brilliant. Yeah. As soon as you can walk, toddlers crawl less. They don't shuffle on their bottoms anymore. In effect, they get rid of all the inefficient movements that have led them to that stage because they've got the perfect movement right. And then, of course, that's not quite strong enough, is it? You need to run. Anybody work with toddlers who are going through that falling running stage, where you're half falling, half running, just barely staying one step ahead of gravity? That's how I jog. That is a stage in getting to be able to run, which makes you secure, it makes you safe from predators. So from an evolutionary perspective, from a very animal perspective, and we are going to look at children as more than just animals, so don't worry about this, but running, walking, jogging, these are your perfect forms of movement, completely effective, completely efficient. You don't need anything else. Every other movement that's inefficient is discarded, and you are now complete as a human being. And at that point, a child suddenly does an incredibly silly, ineffective, inefficient movement, which is skipping. Because skipping takes up way more energy per step than walking. It's not as fast as running, but takes up the same energy. So compared to all of our perfect movements, skipping is ridiculous. And if you don't believe me, think back to any time that you've been in genuine danger in your life. I guarantee you never skipped away from it. Nobody ever skips away from a mugger going, help, 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 I'm being mugged. It doesn't happen because it's so much slower and takes up so much more energy than walking or running. Yeah. So why would any sane person that spent all of this evolutionary imperative getting to that stage suddenly do something silly? And the truth is, of course, it's because it's fun. Of course, it's because it makes you happy. But that's not why they do it. When you skip, that double jump that makes it ineffective and inefficient compared to running is also increasing the bone density in your limbs. And your bone density, the bone density you need for your entire adult life, is built in early childhood. If you do stuff that builds your bones in early years, you are helping prevent osteoporosis many, many years later on, 40 years later on. You're building your bone health for adult life. And this is what everyone forgets about early years. This is why there is a compelling argument for early years specialists to be paid the same as secondary school teachers, because you have more impact. Please don't ask for a pay rise because of what I've said, because I'll get into trouble. But you have more impact on every single aspect of a child's development into being an adult than anybody else in their life. Bone health is a key factor in life expectancy. So we are giving children life expectancy by skipping. It's not just the bone health stuff though, is it? Because you're actually working your heart more, because you're using more energy per skip, per step. And that is building your respiratory system and your cardiovascular system. So your cardiovascular system, building the heart you need for the rest of your life. You don't get a second chance unless you get a heart transplant. It's really important. It's not just that, of course, your respiratory system, your biggest defense against respiratory illnesses such as COVID is having a strong respiratory system. You build it in early childhood. And how do you build it? Through simple movements. Skipping, jumping, running, climbing, rolling, spinning. All of those things build the body that you're going to need to survive. And that is why we believe that the fun and the happiness is merely a symptom, that the cause of the behavior is an instinctive movement by children to build the body they're going to need when they're adults. And that's been backed up by all sorts of different experiments. And my favorite neuroscientist of all time. Now, the guy's name is on this presentation, and you will get a copy of this presentation afterwards. So you don't need to write this down. But if you don't know this guy, if you've never had training with me before, because I do bang on about this guy quite a lot, he's my all-time favorite. There's a guy called Jaak Panksepp. And Jaak Panksepp, nicknamed the rat tickler, because he's the first guy to discover that rats can giggle when you tickle them. Now, I don't know how anybody gets a job like that, but I want to get that job. I want to go to a funding panel somewhere and say, I want to tickle rats. Give me your rats and I will tickle them for you. He doesn't talk like that at all, but not Welsh for some reason. He does actually still put out, he died a few years ago, but there are still YouTube videos out, so you can hear what he sounds like, and you can also hear him break down some of his theories in a really nice, accessible way. So do check this guy out on YouTube and online. But he had two small children, and he'd also got a laboratory full of rats. And one thing he noticed was that some of their behaviors were really similar. The children were playing, tickling, rolling, tussling, running up and down, running after balls, that sort of thing. The rats were doing similar stuff. They were play fighting, they were jumping off stuff, they were rolling around in wheels, they were biting each other, and the rat has got a bite force to cut through a steel cable, but they were just doing it as a nip. They knew exactly how to do it in play. And it's an interesting one because our own human children don't always cope well with boisterous play. And one of the reasons is they've not practiced it enough. Whereas the rats and the puppies and the cats and the dogs and all of those, they've practiced it from birth. So they know how to bite without injuring the other person. Whereas you're going to work with children, all of you, who have not yet developed the awareness of their own strength. Has anybody worked with a child that shoves another child and then looks surprised that there's a child-shaped hole in the wall? That is because they've not developed the brain they need to be able to control their actions. And the one way we can do that is actually help them with boisterous play, but that's the one type of play we stop them doing. So Jaak Panksepp noticed all these similarities, and it turns out that almost all mammals play. They do the same movements. Your children, your bunnies, your dolphins, they're all playing. And this started to intrigue him because he could not understand why such a frivolous behavior would be so entrenched in an entire group of animals. Because he noticed that when the rats were playing and tussling, They were vulnerable. They weren't watching out for falcons. When the children were running up and downstairs and tickling each other, they weren't watching out for wolves, were they? Hopefully you've got no wolves in your house. But they're vulnerable. And any behavior that makes a species vulnerable tends to die out. Evolution will ensure that over a few generations, that behavior will die out. Except it hasn't died out. The opposite is true. In tests in rats, rats who played lots lived longer in the cages than the rats in the cages where they didn't play. Intrinsically linked to life expectancy. And not only has the behavior thrived in all mammals for the last 200 million years, it's also desirable for future generations, because Jaak Panksepp did some very weird stuff, and some of it is not very nice, but this is a really weird one. He put a lady rat in a cage with two boy rats. One of the boy rats had had lots of play. The other boy rat had had no play. So which rat do you think that the lady rat always chose to mate with? The playful rat. So if you are making notes, maybe make a note of that playful rats are sexier than non-playful ones. You heard it here first. And that shows that the play instinct is not just vital for the current generation's life expectancy, it's desirable in a mate for future generations. Now, I have to say, I'm a play specialist, but it's never worked for me. So I don't know where I'm going wrong, but this is so important for the survival of our species. He did further experiments to find out exactly where play sits in the brain. Because you would think it would be an upper brain function, which is our conscious brain. It's our, hello, this is me. My name's Tarquin. I'm going to go and play with my friend Robert to develop my social skills. Where those names came from, I don't know. The point is, it's not. Because what he did, and I'm not condoning this, I genuinely think this is a horrible thing to do. Even though I think he's a legend, I don't believe in animal testing. But he surgically disconnected parts of rats' brains, sewed them back up again, threw them back into a cage with their full brain rat counterparts to see if they still played. And they did. Even missing their entire upper brain, these rats still played with their fellow rats. They rolled around, they tussled, they jumped, they climbed, all of the physical play behaviors that we're talking about. And that proves something really important for us working with children and for behavior. Jaak Panksepp showed us that the urge to play sits not in the upper brain, not in the conscious brain, but in the limbic system. And your limbic system is your primitive animal part of your brain that is actually to do with food and sex and sleep. It's proper primitive stuff. It's only one step above your brainstem, which is sometimes called your reptilian brain. And in fact, the limbic system is called your paleo-mammalian cortex, or even simply just your mammal brain, because it's shared with all mammals. So in humans, give or take, it's about 200,000 years old. But we share it with the dolphins and the cats and the dogs and the rats. So it's actually 200 million year old part of our brain making us play. Because play has such a powerful survival potential to it that it outweighs the short-term vulnerability. And that is the only answer that fits all the facts, is that play, even though it does make you vulnerable in the short term, must be so powerful for the survival of our species that we still keep this behavior generation after generation after generation for 200 million years. And that's because it's in your limbic system. And that means all sorts of wonderful and quite important things. Firstly, it means that physical movements are instinctive for children. They're not conscious. And if we give children the right environment for movement, they will automatically want to do those movements. Like they have a blueprint for it already built in. You put a child in a field, what do they want to do? 9 times out of 10, that child wants to run. Unless the grown-up is saying, oh, slow down, darling. No, don't run too far. I heard a parent telling a child not to run in a park, like not on the road, in a park where there was so much space. Oh, don't run, you'll hurt yourself, on grass. That is an instinctive urge in the limbic system, 200,000-year-old urge. But what if that field is at that angle? What's the child going to want to do? They're going to roll down the hill, because that will develop their inner ear, their balance, their coordination, and all sorts of aspects that are really important for survival. Yeah? So whatever environment they find themselves in, they will hopefully instinctively use that environment unless they've had that urge crushed too much. If you put a crate in a room full of 2-year-olds, turn away, turn back, there's a 2-year-old on a crate. They have to climb it, because that's going to develop all sorts of survival potential bits. But then, of course, when they're on the crate, they have to get off the crate. They have to jump off it or even crawl off it. Yeah. So many of you work in schools. What does a child do or want to do instinctively in a long, thin space? Their limbic system wants them to run, because the long, thin space is the perfect time for developing speed and strength and balance. Unfortunately, for most of you, the long, thin space is a corridor. And this is a bit of homework for you. Watch your corridors when you've got your children back. Watch them, and you'll see some children do this. It's like a run walk. It's a cross between the run and the walk. It's the most bizarre movement, and it's actually conflict in their brain. Their limbic system is telling them instinctively, this is a brilliant opportunity to run. 200,000 years old bit of the brain is protecting you from cave bears. Run, 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 because there could be a cave bear in your future. Yeah? And then the upper brain says, whoa, slow down, sunshine. A grown-up's told me I'm not allowed to run. And so you see this halfway between the two. Run walk. No, it wasn't river dancing. It's a run walk. And that is the child's brain at conflict. Now, you'll notice this. Some children can walk perfectly normally in corridors, can't they? And they never get into trouble. Other children on a daily basis are being shouted at, told off because they're running in corridors. And it's not their fault. It's not bad behavior. It's not even mischievous. It is simply acting on a 200,000-year-old impulse and not being able to stop that. Now, I'm going to talk about tendencies only here, so please don't complain because it is controversial. But there is a tendency for this to be boys. Girls do still run in corridors. Girls still can't sit still. They constantly do instinctive play. But what you'll find is, statistically, more boys will do this. We don't know why. It's probably to do with how they're brought up. There's some interesting studies with monkeys that I can talk to you about on the next session if people are interested. But for now, what we're seeing is some children getting labelled as badly behaved. Why? Not because they're badly behaved, because they're acting on the instincts of their brain. So what I'd like you to do now, I'm going to show you why that's so important. I want all of you to imagine yourself, close your eyes just for a second, and imagine eating your favorite bit of food. It can be anything, chocolate, it can be pizza, it can be curry, but whatever your favorite food is, I want you to just imagine yourself biting into it. And no, gin is not a food, so don't go there. Whatever you feel like, imagine yourself eating it, yeah? Okay. Now, when you imagine stuff, you actually activate the brain in very similar ways to if you're really doing it. And that is a whole other training course, but really powerful for early years. So what I'm hoping is that by imagining eating food, you actually activated your limbic system where the desire for food sits. Yeah. And when you do, you produce a biochemical reward to make you eat more. Yeah. So your limbic system is going, oh, I'm really hungry. I wish I'd had a snack before this. That is giving you the craving for food. Then when you eat the food, the limbic system's going, well done, mate. You've done well there. Here, have some biochemicals to make food taste nice and feel good. Yeah, I hope that makes sense, because these are the exact same chemicals children produce when they move through play. Yeah, they're activating the same part of their brain. And if you're interested in biochemicals, have I got some lovely biochemicals for you? If you're not interested in biochemicals, then go la 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 for a few seconds, because these are so important to physical development that we need to be aware of these. So what we've got is, when you eat food, brilliant. The brain wants you to eat more food to keep you alive. The limbic system has got one job, keeping you alive. When you play, it's the same, because play is going to protect you from all those dangers in the world later on, giving you a stronger heart, stronger respiratory system. So what happens when you play? You produce oxytocin. Oxytocin is massive. If you come on some of my other training courses, we go on about this quite a lot, because oxytocin doesn't just have antidepressant properties. It's also a key factor in promoting bonding and attachment. So when we do training on attachment issues, this is what's missing for children. So when you're with your children and you're playing with them, you're not just forming the attachments by you being with them and being emotionally secure with them and then with you, you're also producing the very chemical that's going to speed that up. Then you've got opioids. Now, opioids are anything with a similar effect to morphine. So I had morphine 6 years ago. I had a kidney removed. Morphine was off the scale strong. And it's not at that level, but it is giving children a tiny hit of similar stuff to morphine, yeah? GABA has got antidepressant properties. And then my all-time favorite, the one that I'd hopefully, of all of these, the one you will remember, benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are a brain hormone that is almost identical to Valium. Valium is a benzodiazepine. It's in that group of chemicals. That's the effect it has on you. And it's prescribed for anxiety. It's prescription level stuff. It's also prescribed in this country for back pain because it has some antispasmodic properties and pain relief properties. In America, it's one of the drugs they use for flight anxiety on short haul flights. Americans are misusing it and not flying, they're just taking the drugs. Yeah. What this means for you, physical movement and play, is that when your children are playing and they feel safe and happy and can move freely without the grown up making them feel rubbish for their movements, they are literally stoned on play. And I don't mean that as a joke. I mean, they are actively producing chemicals that if you were to squeeze those children out, I mean, obviously don't ever do that, that would be wrong. You could sell those on the black market. These have a street value. So your children are literally stoned, not metaphorically stoned. Their pupils are dilating with the chemicals. And you've all seen the children when they get so excited, you know, and the sad thing about that is people mistake that for bad behavior. And then they try and control those children. So if it's a school lunchtime and you've got children who are having a brilliant lunchtime and they're like, oh, and they're so flooded with the optimum chemicals for well-being, also for learning, would you believe? And then the lunchtime stuff goes, right, stop, blow whistle, everyone sit in, sit still, listen to a teacher. It's too sudden. You've just gone from full-on chemical brilliant to sit still and listen. And that's why you will sometimes get negative behavior. So people think it's the play that's causing the behavior, that wild play that we sometimes see in our children. It's not. It's the sudden stop to all of those chemicals. And what we need to do is transition our children. So if you're a primary school teacher or even secondary school, it makes much more sense to have the first part of the lesson more playful, so you can slowly bring children down from that state of high, full-on physical, energetic play to the calm, being able to listen and learn. And actually, on the next session, I will share with you a couple of transition games that you can use in your room or your classroom to actually get this effect without it feeling like you're stopping children. Okay? But for now, I just wanted to share those with you because they're so incredibly powerful that if you take them away from a child, it is the biochemical equivalent of starving them. These are the same chemicals you get through food. You would never starve a child as a punishment, would you? And yet on a daily basis, some of our children have playtime taken away from them as a punishment. And if anybody wants to take this further, you're welcome to have a copy of this diagram. I have recently been in discussions with several head teachers, so I have 6 absolutely solid reasons why the taking of a child's break away from them is not a valid form of punishment. Okay, I don't have too much time to go into it now, and I know it's a controversial one. I know some people will argue. They'll say, well, it works as a deterrent and all that. It does work as a deterrent because it's horrible. And, you know, based on conditioning experiments with rats, you know that if you electrocute the rat, it doesn't do the behavior. That's not what we want for our children, though, is it? Children aren't rats. So what we're really looking at is that taking away an opportunity to play and be physically active, and that's really important, is firstly in breach of government guidelines on physical activity levels, but it's also potentially emotionally damaging for that child because it's the one time in the day when they could be producing benzodiazepines, so self-medicating on the very drug that they would be prescribed if they went to a doctor with anxiety. And actually, I will just briefly say this, 6 states in America have already banned this practice of taking children's break away from them as a punishment. It's now mandatory that for whatever, there's no good reason to take away a child's break. They have to have, they call it recess, don't they, in America? And yet in the UK, it's a significant number of schools still keep children at break if they've not finished their work or if they've misbehaved. And whilst it will have some effect in the short term, long term, it could be potentially genuinely damaging. And it's a weird thing, isn't it, that we try all the way through early years to get children to move more and speak more. And then key stage 1, it is sort of keep still and be quiet. It's you know, sit still and shut up, basically. And that's the enemy, not just of physical development, but all the other aspects of development. And it's the opposite of effective learning. We will come back to that later this morning, or it's not this morning, sorry, this afternoon, or possibly on the next session. So I'd like you to do something for me now, because I know I've been talking for a while, and that is the sad thing about this. I'm talking about how sitting still listening to a grown-up speak is the least effective form of learning, whilst unfortunately being not just a grown-up speaking, but on a screen, which is an even more ineffective way of learning. However, I'm going to try and break it up a bit. So I'd like you to have a short break, and and go and refresh your drinks, go to the toilet if you need to, just a few minutes. But while you're out there, I would like you to forage for something for me. And that just means find something interesting. So anything in your house, your classroom, wherever you are, find an interesting item to bring back to the screen. I've already seen one lady's cat leapt onto the screen at one point. So you are welcome to bring your cat if you want to, if they'll stay there for long enough. But anything goes. So have a short 3 or 4 minute break. And when you come back, bring something interesting back. Okay, so off you go. Okay, I think we'll make a start because we haven't got long left. So if you could show your items, if you've got some items to show to the screen. I can't see them all because I only get a short strip across the top, but it is always interesting to see what different people find interesting. I don't even want to know. Is that a fish jug, Sarah? It is a fish jug. Other Sarah, sorry, that is lovely. That lantern is very... and it's nice to see your face because when you lean back, you vanish and you look like you're in witness protection. So you're like some shadowy figure at the back. So right, what else have we got? Oh, wow. Sally, I don't know. Is that a miniature Ferris wheel type thing? Wow, that's amazing. And Alison, that is just terrifying. I don't know. They are... It's like, what's the... So, I don't know. Nice... what's Tracy got? I can't see what Tracy's got. It's an interesting rock, is it? So you've all found completely different things, and including some household pets. So I'm going to one more. Vicky Garrett, what is that?
It's a sand rose carved from the Sahara Desert.
Oh, wow. All right, Vicky wins. It wasn't a competition. It wasn't a competition. So I didn't bring anything, unfortunately, but I have got a makeup brush that my wife gave me because apparently I get a shiny white forehead in my training courses and she thought it would help. It clearly doesn't. I still have a shiny white forehead. But the reason I got you to do that foraging is because I couldn't do the other thing that I wanted to do with you because we're not live. Now, there has been some really interesting studies, and this chemical I'm going to talk to you about now is mind-blowing. And if you've not heard of this one, it's worth a Google because it's only the tip of the iceberg how amazing this chemical is. And Jaap Panksepp, amongst others, discovered when his rats and its other mammals as well, were engaged in physical play. Yeah. So the play fighting, the rough and tumble stuff was really good for this, but also the climbing and the jumping. They produce not just the feel-good hormones like benzodiazepines, not just the anti-anxiety medication. They produce something called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. You don't ever need to remember that one because it is just BDNF. But if you do want to remember it, the best way to remember it is just by realizing how rubbish a name that is. Because if you actually unpick it, brain-derived just means made in the brain. Neuro means brain again, and trophic means growing, and factor means, well, juice or stuff. So it's made in the brain, brain growing juice. That's exactly what it does. This stuff makes your brain grow faster. It's a brain growth hormone. It is like, I've done it as a plant food because that's exactly what it does. It's baby bio for the brain. And it is so intrinsically important for your brain reaching its full potential that without it, we really fully don't understand how bad things can be. But if it's in animals without this stuff, it affects every aspect of their development and well-being. In older people, it deteriorates and it potentially is linked to Alzheimer's and dementia. It's a viable treatment for all sorts of things, including post-traumatic stress disorder. But we're learning about it all the time. It is really powerful stuff, and it just aids neurogenesis. It makes your brain grow. Now, adults, if you're over 25 or 26, you probably have got your brain fully grown. It's mature. You can still change it. You still develop it. There's all sorts of lovely research about how you can change your brain even as an adult. But this doesn't mean that brain-derived neurotrophic factor is useless for you, because for us, it's a key factor in brain cell health. It promotes positive brain cell health. So BDNF is brilliant. And when do we produce it? When we exercise, when we are physically active. But here's the crucial bit. You have to be enjoying it. So does anybody here love running and actually feel like they get a buzz from running? Yeah. So if you're shaking heads, somebody's just waved. Yeah. So for many people, running, so for me, for instance, I've never once felt a buzz from running. I've hated every single step of every single run I've ever done in my life, which isn't many, I'll give you that. So I'm not producing brain-derived neurotrophic factor from running. However, that person who waved, or your annoying mate who does a 5K before breakfast every morning and then tells you about it repeatedly, yeah, the ones I'm talking about, the really fit friends that you've got that make you feel rubbish. Well, they are producing brain-derived neurotrophic factor because they have got to the stage where they're actually really enjoying running. So if you don't like physical sport, exercise, or anything like that, which many of us don't, in fact 70% of us don't, you're actually better off having a tickle fight with your children, or putting on some like 1980s music track, disco tracks, and having a silly dance around the living room. That is going to do way more for you in terms of your brain health than getting on a treadmill or going to the gym or going for a run. You have to be enjoying it. But in these rats, it was the boisterous play, it was the jumping, it was the big stuff. But then one other thing caused BDNF to spike: exploring and foraging. Being able to explore your environment increased that. So rats that could explore and bring stuff back and interact with their environments also produced BDNF. So I couldn't do a big wrestling tickle fight with you all because obviously this is online, but I thought I could at least get you foraging. So hopefully when you spotted your interesting item, you had a tiny little hit of a chemical that's going to make your brain healthier. For our children in early years, this is so crucial. It is the difference between a child having a full-size brain, the brain that is their potential for brain size, and having a brain that is permanently less big than it should be. It's that significant. And you produce it when you're physically active, but you have to be enjoying it. And that is taken away from our children in primary school when we make it all about who's the winner, who's the best, who's the second best. You guys are average and the rest of you are rubbish. That takes away not just the confidence, not just their ability to do that stuff, but also the potential for brain growth. The time when we get it most is when we're freely moving by being silly, joyful and playful, and when we're exploring. I will say this, the foraging, it's worth bearing in mind, it's a really useful activity to do. It's just leave stuff around your setting. We do this all the time. I've got a big box of rocks and stones with interesting fossils and things in, and I just plant them all over the place. Don't even tell the children they're there sometimes. And so a child will come running up to you with a big shiny white stone going, oh, look what I found. And then somebody goes, I found one too. And it's just like, it goes mad. Then children running around trying to find these wonderful stones. There's hundreds of them. They're a nightmare to carry from the van, I have to be honest. But that's, in terms of the brain development, you wouldn't necessarily look at that and go, wow, that's development. But it is massive for their development and really mathematical as well. If you're currently doing the mathematics training that we've got out there as well, we mentioned this because humans are the only species that would try to find similar things. A dog or a cat will forage, but they won't instinctively, like humans do, try, I found one rock that's round, can I find another? And that's a very early development in children and really quite an odd, unusual thing for a species to do. So on that note, with all this in mind, it actually makes sense that the brain knows what it's doing. The brain knows how to take a vulnerable child and turn them into a fit, strong, healthy adult. But unfortunately, it's being restricted. And sometimes we actually need to make sure our parents are aware that the babies they have do come with their own startup program. They have got these instincts there. But if we constantly restrict them, that's where the problems are going to happen. I'm going to talk to you about some of the problems now, and it is really upsetting stuff, actually, because it's got a lot more serious than people may already be aware of, because there's some new research that's not even been published yet that is really heartbreaking. So in terms of your parents, if they've got babies, it is all about the tummy time. So many parents will say, oh, and my child doesn't like tummy time. But it's about those moments of early physical movement and exploration that are so critical for their brain growth, but also underpinning every other aspect of development. And one of the biggest mistakes people make is to separate development. Communication language is there, physical development is there, they don't ever meet. They're not separate in children. In our early children, they're overlapping massive areas of the brain. The more you move, the better you can speak. I can prove that for you in a minute as well. That's not just rhetoric. So we do need to somehow get this across to parents. One of the ways is actually making movement fun again. So when we do our parent training sessions, we do get parents moving in a way, just like that dinner man, that doesn't feel like you're being told to. So silly things like superhero games, like disco dancing, like the things that you do just naturally without it being, oh God, I'm not very good. Does that make sense? And once you can get parents to experience that joy, some of them for the first time in years, that's when they can start to pass that on to their children. And then they're much more likely to turn the television off, grab their baby's hands and start going, ah, boo, 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 ah, boo, boo, boo. And I don't know what age of children your parents have, because they'll all be different. But here's a really nice one for young children that you can actually expand as the children get older. And it's a really simple one. It's just called I clap, you clap, we clap. And it is just sort of I clap, the child, you clap, you clap, and you have to say it out loud because it helps with communication, language, and sequencing. So I clap, then the child, if they can, they say I clap. But if they're still too young, then you grab their hands and you go, you clap. And then you do it together, high five, or grabbing the child's hands and you both clap together. I clap, you clap, we clap. That's all it is. It's repetition because it's embedding stuff, but it's also those simple movements, repeating the same movement, so it's activating the brain. It's really powerful stuff. And then you mix it up. I stretch, you stretch, we stretch. I wiggle, you wiggle, we will. I dance, you dance. So whatever the age of the child, you make the movements more and more. I run to the end of the field, you run to the end. You could get really, really advanced stuff. I cartwheel, you cartwheel. Whatever you feel like doing, but it's just about doing movements together with an adult and a child together, bonding, nurturing, producing oxytocin, but also physical movement at the same time. So if you can do stuff like that and encourage parents to do more stuff like that with their very young children, you can help prevent a lot of the problems that you are going to encounter when the children reach your setting, because you might not work with babies. You might be in a reception class. All of that early stuff has already been done, and you're going to see the problems already in reception class. Yeah, but even if you work with 2-year-olds, that the most significant time for brain growth has already gone, 0 to 6 months. Okay, hopefully that makes sense because I'm going to depress you all now. In 2000, they thought that this was a good opportunity to experiment on children. So children born in 2000 were part of what's called the Millennium Cohort Study. They plotted the children's capabilities or achievements, whatever, throughout their lives. Yeah, so these children are 21 now, but in terms of physical movement, there was a huge study done by Sally Goddard Blythe, who is an expert in neuromotor immaturity, which you probably will call physical delay. It's the same thing. Children not able to do the stuff that they should for the age they are. Yeah, neuro means brain, motor means movement, the control of the brain over the body, brain-body control, but they're immature. They can't do stuff. And she studied lots of schools, 2007 onwards. And so in primary schools, she was showing results of up to 40% of some schools having children that suffered from some form of neuromotor immaturity, from quite minor to quite severe. Yeah. Now, the weird thing about this is that in every single case of neuromotor immaturity, there's a corresponding delay in other areas of development, including speech and language. And so when you've got 40% of a class who haven't moved enough, you're actually looking at 40% of the class who are not reaching their full potential in other areas of development. And that is really serious. But the most depressing part about this is that Sally Goddard Blythe, and I don't think she's published this yet, but if she has, it's only just been published. She announced it at a conference last year. She's gone back into the same schools to test the same groups of children, obviously the younger children now, and 80%. It's doubled in just over 10 years, the number of children who have not moved enough in early childhood, showing knock-on effects on other aspects of their development. She's got a whole raft of tests you can do on your children. And each test by itself is not indicative. You have to take the whole and seeing what children can do and what they can't do. One of the tests is a weird one. It's the walking in a straight line by putting one foot in front of the other. And I can't even do that. So I don't know. And I don't have neuromotor immaturity. So not every test is going to. And also that same test is used by American police to see if you're drunk or not. So you might just be drunk. The point is that there's all sorts of tests that they do. And in every case, there is a corresponding delay in other areas, which is frightening because we're up to 79.5%, so just under 80%. Now, one of the reasons this is significant, and this is what Sally Goddard Blythe does a lot of. She goes into primary schools and actually does a little bit with early years as well, trying to stop it happening. But in primary school, she goes in and gets children to do the very movements they should have done in early childhood. She gets them doing all sorts of like a 6-month intensive movement program involving crawling and spinning and jumping and all of these things, walking tight ropes, all of that stuff. And in 6 months, what happens is those children's handwriting improves, their ability to draw, their maths. It's bizarre how utterly linked all of these outcomes are, because what she's doing is helping them to come to terms with the brain body they need to be a human being. Because that's what it all boils down to, whether your brain can control your body. Yeah. And one of the big issues about this is something called retained birth reflexes. And all that means is every baby has got reflexes built in, usually survival stuff, like so the baby will instinctively go towards the nipple to feed from birth. It's an instinct. Yeah. So you need these instincts. But What you don't want is a 14-year-old always going towards the nipple. That's going to cause problems. So these birth reflexes switch off. Yeah, they become dormant or completely switched off. And some of them, if they are kept active, cause significant problems for the child's development. So I've got this presentation that you've got. I've actually listed a few for you, but today I'm only going to talk about one, but there are other slides that will just give you an idea, but there's loads of these. So the palmar reflex is the one that you're probably most familiar with. Palmar reflex is that when you put your finger in the baby's palm, it will grab your hand. Not called the palmar reflex because of that, which I thought, but because the guy who discovered it was called Palmer. That was a weird one. But this is the one that parents think their children are holding their hands. So please don't tell the parents that this is just a reflex, because that would be mean. Let them have that illusion that the baby is holding their hands. Emerges quite young, and once the brain reaches a level of cerebral cortex maturity, switches off, no longer needed anymore. The trouble is, it's the big physical movements that bring the brain up to that level of maturity. If you've not done enough movement, if you are a bucket baby, chances are that is still semi-dormant, so it's still there a little bit, or fully active still, all the way through into primary school. And that is significant, because if you're wanting children to do a pincer grip to hold a pen, and they're instinctively wanting to hold the pen like that, that means it's much, much more difficult to do those fine motor skills. If that reflex is still in the child, they are going to struggle to write. And I know there's some people here from reception class, but if on day one of reception, you're just doing a blanket, right, every child write your name, that is a child who's going to find that task really unpleasant. And unfortunately for those children, regardless of intelligence, that could start the road to reluctance with writing on day one, not because they don't like the writing side of it, but it's the physical sensation of not being able to grasp that pen properly. And that is really sad, because that could be a child who could potentially have genius level intelligence, who never fulfills their academic potential, because on day one of reception, we're saying, oh, this writing lark's not much good, is it? Because they can't hold the pen. The sad thing is, though, it might not even be neuromotor immaturity, because we know that those skills, that brain-body control, doesn't develop in some children until they're 6 years old. And that's why every other country in Europe starts later than we do, because they know this, that neurologically children are not ready for writing or reading at age 4 or 5. But our country's gone a different route. We can't argue with it. It's a real challenge, but we just need to try and balance out as much positive play, as much big movements as we can, to make sure our children are as ready as possible. If you don't believe me that that's unpleasant, by the way, you can test this for yourself. Not now, when this is finished. Take your shoes and socks off, try and grab a pen with your toes and try and write your name on a bit of paper. That's how hard it is for some children, age 5, day 1 of reception class, trying to write their name. It's really, really difficult, yeah? So why is this significant? Well, unfortunately, the pincer grip movement on a pen, the picking stuff up, the fine skills, that understanding how to pick an egg up without crushing it, all of that is a developmental stage. If you have got stuck at the grabbing with your hand stage, it's not just going to stop you holding a pen, it's going to delay all your other fine motor skills as well. And that is going to have a hugely significant impact on your children. Does anybody know, and I will give 1,000,000 points to anybody that gets this right, because I didn't know this until a couple of years ago, what the finest motor skill that we ever do as humans is? More fine than brain surgery or anything like that, piano playing. There's one skill that is finer than anything else that we ever do. Has anybody got an idea? Don't worry if you don't, because it is a bit of a weird, bit of obscure knowledge. I'll just give you 20 seconds to see if anybody can come up with this. I will just say that the 1,000,000 points don't mean anything. You don't get anything for your 1,000,000 points. So there's not that much incentive for you to do this. However, it's an interesting one. Anyone? Right. In that case, I shall tell you. Cutting out. No, there are some really quite fine ones. So accurate use of scissors, shoe tying, sewing. Yep, absolutely. But the finest motor skill that children will ever do is the movements of the tongue to form words. We always think of communication and language as almost a cerebral thing, and it's not all that at all. There's a degree of brain-body control that's needed. And just in one sentence, think about the different twists and turns and movements of the tongue, which is a muscle, which needs to be controlled by the brain, that you would do for just even the simplest of words, let alone complex, nuanced sentences. that requires the most incredible amount of brain-body control. It's the finest motor skill you'll ever use. And that is one of the reasons why, if you have retained birth reflexes or neuromotor immaturity, you're likely to have a corresponding communication language delay, because you've been delayed in doing the one thing that humans do best, which is communicating. I hope that makes sense. Shall I tell you another really fine motor skill, which people don't realize? Sitting still. But we'll come back to that towards the end. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to whiz through the next birth reflexes, just because I wanted them to be in the presentation for you, but I'm looking at the time, and because we started late, I'm not going to go into them. But there's all sorts of different reflexes, and all of them can cause problems if they stay in that child's behaviour. So if they're staying semi-dormant or even fully active, that can go all the way into primary school and can genuinely affect a child for the rest of their life. The way we undo this is exactly what Sally Goddard Blythe does with her children in primary school. You get them doing movements. Yeah. But for us, it's not about what Sally Goddard Blythe does, lining them up and getting them to do these various movements by saying, you're going to do this now. For our early children, it's about using the blueprint they've already got in their brain, but by giving them permission, space, time, resources to actually do those movements themselves, and crucially role modeling them by being a moving adult in more ways than one. Somebody said about chronic ear infections in early childhood can also lead to retained reflexes. Yeah, I've been reading about that recently, because rather embarrassingly, one of the effects of COVID for me was to get glue ear. I'm deaf in one ear now, and I'm, because of waiting lists, I've been, since November, I've been deaf, and I can't get an appointment till April to get my ear sorted. But they think it's glue ear. They think it's what some children have, and it is utterly disorientating. So physically, I'm less able, because my inner ear is constantly slurping about and tinnitus and stuff. So I've been looking it up, and yes, it can have all sorts of effects on physical development across the board, just having your ear not working. Anyway, I will move on from birth reflexes. I will highlight this, we have talked about, because one of the finest motor skills that we do as well is sitting still. People think that sitting still is an absence of control, and it's not. You need extreme control. You need a lot of brain-body control to sit still. So again, day one of reception, your children may not have developed that. It's not anybody's fault. It might not be neuromotor immaturity. They might have had the most amazing, they might have come from your setting where they're moving constantly and they're having joy in their movements, but they're simply not ready to sit still. And it's interesting, Ofsted did a survey of reception class boys, and they said, what's the worst thing about reception class? That was one of their questions. And these 3 boys answered the question. One said, sitting still, carpet time, it's boring. And then the next boy said, yeah, it ruins your playtime. And the final boy, best boy ever, because he says, yeah, it ruins your life. And that's on an official Ofsted document, because that's exactly what a 5-year-old said was the worst thing, being made to sit still. And that is frightening for children. That seems to be how we do education now. I visited my son's secondary school, and it was just classes of children, young people, sitting still, watching a screen. The least effective form of learning, but also something many children find very difficult. If you've not done enough big movements, you can forget the sitting still. And the more you try and force the child to sit still, the more frustrated, the more angry they're going to get, the more anxious, the less they're going to learn. And if you go on any of my other training courses where we talk about the dangers of anxiety, you'll see that this is the last thing you want for learning is an anxious child. So this is something my son's class teacher said. She said, oh God, he's such a fidgeter. I'm going to have to glue him to the chair. And that's made me think, and I've been writing today. I got, how you procrastinate and don't get on with your proper work. I've been designing a poster with the glue pot, and it's special classroom glue. Glues your children to the chair. Guaranteed no production of BDNF. Guaranteed to lower educational development. All this stuff. But anyway, this is what some teachers are saying we need to do to children in year 1 is glue them to a seat, when actually we really need to unglue them. And it's got a double meaning as well, because if we're glued to a screen, it's having a similar effect, sedentary behaviour, those cycles of sedentary behaviour. And that is one of the issues, is that children get caught in a cycle of sedentary behaviour. It's actually really difficult to break. And one of the things that we've got to do as adults working with young children is to recognise that we're all stuck with it. We all know that physical exercise is good for us. We could all go to the gym every day when lockdown's over, but we don't, because it's so much easier to sit in and watch the telly. And I'm as guilty as anybody. And it becomes then, unfortunately, in children, it becomes their preferred way of accessing the world. So you could go outside in a wood and make a bow and arrow and shoot things with a homemade bow and arrow. You could just imagine how much fun that is to a 5-year-old. But you've got to get your coat on, haven't you? And you've got to get your wellies on, and you've got to find a forest, and you've got to, and oh, well, here's an app that does it for you. You might as well sit down and do that. And I'm not judging that, because we're all guilty of it, but it becomes cyclical in children, which means it's much harder. And sometimes in early years, you'll get children who've already started to get into that cycle of preferring passively watching stuff or passively accessing the world. And it is really bad for them. And we sometimes need to be, well, we need to be enthusiastic about movement, even when we're not, basically. We need to be like, hey, yeah, let's go outside. And inside you're going, oh, God, I just want to watch a box set. I play on my son's PlayStation when he's gone to bed. I love passive entertainment stuff, but I know how useful this is for children. So let's unglue our children. Let's let them jump and leap and have fun and be physically active, because without it, you're not producing the very chemicals that are going to grow their brain. Right. We are coming towards the end of this, but I just somebody mentioned about boys having a surge in testosterone. And you will notice more boisterous play activities coming out from those children. It's roughly every 2 years, actually. You might see at age 2, age 4, definitely. But also, it goes on. I'll tell you what's interesting, though, not today's course, but there's all of the stuff about brain growth being experiential is leading us towards a slightly different view of the differences between boys and girls. And that if even structural changes in the brain are experiential rather than genetic, then actually there's mounting evidence to suggest that even the differences between boys and girls are experiential rather than genetic. And even like quite senior scientists are actually changing their viewpoint on this to think that it is probably much more environmental than we thought. And there's these experiments they've done where they hand a family a baby dressed in blue and a baby dressed in pink, but it's the same baby, but the family doesn't know it. And the girl, it's like, oh, who's the little princess? And then the boy is all the big boisterous, daddy and boy play. And instinctively already from birth, we're actually treating our children differently. I don't want to get into a controversial argument about that, but I just listened to a radio show about it recently. So yes, you will get testosterone surges, you will get boisterous play. But when I do boisterous play training, I'm really keen to get across that it's really good for girls as well, because the benefits are all there. And actually, boisterous play is one of the things that Jaak Panksepp identified as building the frontal lobes in mammals. Now, in rats and dogs and cats, that's really important, but in humans, it's off the scale, because your frontal lobes are responsible not just for your sense of self, but for your behavior, your moral code, your empathy, your sense of ethics. So all these really important concepts being built by probably the least well-behaved kind of play, which I think is quite interesting, because we often restrict boisterous play thinking that it is just violent and doesn't have a point to it, but it's actually growing the part of the brain that will teach our children to understand their own behavior, to know their own bodily limits as well, to not shove the child through the wall because they now know their own strength. And that's all upper brain functions. And they don't fully form until you're 25, 26 years old. So you're looking at, it's an uphill struggle in early years to get children to understand concepts of empathy, but it starts very early. And one of the ways in which we can help it is to give them the brain structure to do it. Yeah? Does that make sense? So we are going to move on because we're running short of time, but BDNF's coming back. I love BDNF because it's even more important than I first shared with you. BDNF isn't just a brain growth hormone. It's a brain repair hormone as well. And when a child experiences extreme stress and anxiety, and again, if you do training with me on other subjects, this is something I go on about so much, because I think right now we're at a crisis point for our children. When I hear of schools talking about catch-up curriculum, not even bothered to sort out the physical damage caused by anxiety, that is not going to work. It cannot work. It's literally, the children do not have the brain connections for it to work until you bring their anxiety levels down. And I could go on about this all day, the genuinely physically brain damaging and structural changes to do with anxiety. And it is the thing people forget. They think it's just, oh, child's having a bad day. It's not. It's a physical structural change to the brain caused by anxiety. So if you've got a child coming back after lockdown who's had a negative experience of lockdown, their brain is a different shape to when they went away. And you can't do that overnight. You can't just say, oh, let's do 2 days of nice stuff and then we're back to the maths and the English. You've got to heal the brain and you've got to physically rewire it. Okay, it's actually, if you're interested in taking this further, look up experience-dependent neuroplasticity. It's on another slide, so you don't need to write that down. But it's how children's brains physically structural change to meet whatever challenges they're having. And it can be really powerful. And it can take months to rewire a brain. You're looking 6 months minimum for some of our children. Anyway, One of the aspects that we talk about anxiety is a chemical called cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that you all produce in great quantities when you're stressed. And you're probably very stressed now because it's first week back with school for some of you. It's been a horrible time for all of us. So we've got a lot of cortisol in our system. It is poisonous. It is toxic. And when injected into rats, it messes them rats up, is all I'll say. You're looking at aggression, lack of sleep, depressive things, lack of appetite. You're looking at, or overeating in some cases as well. You're looking at just devastating chemical. And we are, as animals, sadly, but we are trained to deal with cortisol. The type of play we do in early years, where we get a little bit excited, a little bit scared, but happy at the same time. So there's a crocodile in the cracks in the pavement, or what time is it, Mr. Wolf? And then that goes through teenage years where we're playing knock door run and other sillier things. That is actually training our brain to cope with these chemicals. Yeah. So that's where risk and challenge comes into this. And if there's time at the end of the second session, I might come back to that, because actually it's a key component of physical development where we actually challenge ourselves, where we go outside our comfort zone. But it is also intrinsically linked to life expectancy. But if you've not trained yourself, you cope with cortisol and other hormones not as well. Anyway, cortisol causes physical damage to several areas of your brain, including your hippocampus. Now, your hippocampus is where you process memories of emotional events. So it helps with our fear responses. If we're processing them properly, then we know what to be scared of and what not to be scared of. Yeah. And it helps us in our dealing with danger. It's a very useful part of the brain. However, when it's compromised by stress and anxiety, it stops working. And it means that we have an overwhelmingly anxious response to stuff that isn't dangerous, or we don't respond in the right time or the right way. So it's a really odd part of the brain. And actually, there's a bit of a backlash at the moment against the old kind of Sigmund Freud style of talking cure for people with anxiety and depression. Because one of the arguments is that actually, if it's physical damage to the hippocampus and with your limbic system, you need to sort that first before you can talk through your emotions to be as effective as possible. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm not going into too much detail because cortisol damages the brain, especially the hippocampus. What cures that damage? BDNF. When you make rats stressed, their BDNF levels drop in their brain, their hippocampus becomes damaged. So rats that are under stress, anxiety, really bad for them. Inject the BDNF back into them, the damage to the hippocampus begins to heal. It is as effective as lots of different treatments on the market for things like post-traumatic stress disorder, but really interestingly, it's been found to be as effective as Ritalin, the behavior drug in children. So Ritalin is a drug that we give to children with behavior problems, so ADHD, for instance. I have ADHD. I've never been medicated, but for some of the children I work with, Ritalin's been a real lifesaver. So I'm not having to go at Ritalin. I think in the right circumstances, it's brilliant for some children. I do think it's overprescribed. I think sometimes it's prescribed to children who maybe didn't need it. They just needed to play a bit more, be a bit more physical, but in a joyful way rather than in a kind of being told what to do way. I think it would really help those children. And we've seen this firsthand when we work with our children with severe behavioural difficulties, when we take them out into the woods and we mess them out with them, doing just whatever we feel like, loose parts play, climbing trees, jumping, running. Quite often they forget to misbehave. And even children that we've been told, you can't work with them. Nobody's ever been able to work with them before. And I'm not saying we're brilliant, because it's not about that. It's literally about we've just given them such a fun time being able to play freely, working with their brain, that they've flooded themselves with biochemicals, and suddenly, whoosh, they're actually behaving, because the very biochemicals they're producing actually promote positive behavior, which is really interesting. And we've seen so many different times when children have actually changed almost like different children. Interestingly, another experiment showed that children who've got grass underfoot behave better than children who've got concrete underfoot, who behave better than children inside, indoors, which kind of goes back to those chicken experiments, doesn't it? That's why the chickens need grass underfoot, but for children, it actually improves their behavior, which is bizarre. But I think it's because it's a more natural environment. It works more with their brain. So, okay, on that note, we are on the home straight now. It is just worth bearing in mind that in terms of physical activity levels for children, it genuinely is the times when children can freely move that make the biggest difference. It doesn't mean you can't do structured movement activities with your children. And I don't want anyone to just stop doing those things, because they can be really fun. And we do all sorts of things that are quite structured. So when we talked about children being still and sitting still. One of the mistakes we sometimes make is when we do physical activity with children, it's like a sport or something, what the sports coach will do is make the child out of the game if they don't do well at the game. Yeah. So it's like a way of keeping score. And I don't know what the sports coaches are thinking is going to happen, that the child will then watch other children having fun and then by telepathy get better at the game. But the truth is they don't improve because they're not playing it, which means that they're going to be out of the game the next time and the next time. And what you're actually doing is marginalising or increasing the gap between the children who are good at physical activity and the children who are not so good. That's all it does. And yet every sports coach, well, not every sports coach, because there are some really good sports coaches now who don't do that. But a lot of sports coaches still do that. A lot of PE teachers still do that. But don't we all do it when we play musical statues with our children? We all have a game where intrinsically, if you move, which, hang on, we're supposed to be trying to make children move now. If you move, you're out of the game, you watch other children have fun, and you stand still, bored, or you misbehave, or you join back in anyway, yeah? And, children's parties, I've done it, we've all done it. So sometimes it's worth, in terms of physical activity, rethinking our own practices. And I do musical statues in a completely different way now. And I'd love to be able to try it with you guys. Well, I'm not going to, because it would be really awkward and weird to do it over a screen. Probably be awkward and weird in real life as well. I've never tried this one with adults, but with children, it's brilliant. So instead of having a child out of the game, forced to watch other children have fun, for moving, which is really, we want children to move. And what's sad about this is the children who are quite innovative and creative with their movement. The ones who do a really interesting freeze, like they're standing on one leg doing that, tend to wobble more, so they're picked on more. So they're almost being penalised for their creativity. Anyway, so instead of that, we don't have any child out. And that's not because we're anti-competition. I have to stress that. We do still do the odd competitive game because competition is part of growing up, but we handle it completely differently. We make sure that the emphasis isn't on the winner or the loser. It's on the fun of doing it. So even if you do lose, you want to do it again. So musical statues, dancing away, the music stops. But in this case, one child is the leader. Yeah, and that's really empowering for that child. If you don't think your children are going to be comfortable being a leader to start with, make it you. Make it the grown-up who's the leader. And the minute the music stops, every child looks to the leader and has to do the exact same pose that the leader's doing while they freeze. So if you're the leader, do something that all the children can do. Yeah, and all the children will look at you and go, oh, I can do that too. And they're all trying to copy you, which is a really lovely neurological process in itself. When the children are the leader, they will try and do stuff that you can't do. And that's really empowering as well. When that child does the splits and you're looking at them going, really? Really? I'm supposed to do that? But it's such a lovely thing to do. And you swap the leader each time, or you have one leader for a few times. And it's musical statues, all of the benefits of dancing like freely, activating the brain, all the benefits of then stopping and being still, which is another skill. Remember, it's another brain-body control thing. But at no point does the child feel left out. And it's simple things like that that will enhance physical movement. It's about looking at where the brain wants to go and helping the child move with that brain. And don't stop it dead. Daniel, get down from that tree and come and do some colouring. It's not going to work. Daniel's brain wants him to do physical stuff at that point. You can get him to do some colouring, but you need to do it more gradually and transition Daniel. And if he can't climb the tree, and climbing trees is amazing, so he should be able to climb the tree, but if there's a reason for him not to be able to climb the tree, you need to give him something in the same ballpark instead. Daniel, come down from the tree. You know that's not safe, but I tell you what, let's play Last Ninja, which is the one that's on my website, that's the Dinner Lady Killer, which if you've got older children, Last Ninja works really well. We start with 4-year-olds on Last Ninja, but it doesn't always work. We do it all the way up to 16-year-olds with Last Ninja. However, on my website, there is also a game called Crocodile, which you'll all remember because we all played this at school. You know, that Can We Cross Your Golden River, that crocodile game? We start that with our 2-year-olds. And we go all the way through because we change the game. We adapt it as they get older. So it actually introduces them to the idea of playing a group game, and it grows with the children, if that makes sense. So that is on the website. Feel free to download those at any point. Okay, final bit of today. The one word that's missed off every child development theory, of all of your curriculum documents, of the EYFS, of development matters, of every single thing that you'll ever read about children, is joy. It's a 3-letter word that is so dramatically undervalued, it's actually damaging for our children. I cannot stress how important this factor is for our children. Without joy, you don't want to move. Without joy, though, you don't want to speak. Joy of words and sounds and language is a key motivator for communication language, but it's completely ignored on every single communication language training course you ever go on. If you don't enjoy it, you don't want to do it. And in fact, the overwhelmingly negative language that some children are hearing in the home, especially during lockdown, is actually eroding their ability to speak, it's actually making them not want to develop speech and language. It's actually eroding their vocabulary, their expression, all of that stuff, which has a knock-on effect on their behaviour. But in terms of physical exercise and physical movement, this is crucial. And this is what has happened to 70% of you watching this now. Because Sport England are saying that 70% of children disengage in sport and physical activity completely in primary school. And it stays. You then grow up into an adult who doesn't like physical activity and sport. And the reason is because a crime has been committed against you. Somebody has actually stolen something from you, and that is the joy of movement. The joy of movement that we all had as children. We didn't get that until we were older, going through primary into secondary with PE teachers and sports coaches that made us feel rubbish, that made us want to get a note from our mum to get out of it, that made us want to hide in the broom cupboard rather than do cross-country running or rugby. For me, I was really short as a child. I'm 6'7" now, so it's fine. I'm still short, but I was really short as a child. Put me on a rugby field, I was just flattened. Age 13, still not having gone through puberty, but being at the bottom of a scrum of loads of sweaty pseudo men. It was the most horrible experience of my life. So I stopped doing sport straight away. Yeah. I was very lucky, actually. I discovered racket sports later on in my life. So, I played badminton and squash and stuff now. Well, I did. And so I'm not massively unfit, but the joy was taken away from me. And you need joy to want to move. So the question that I'm going to leave you with before next time is how are we going to do that in our children who already may have the joy of physical movement started to be taken away from that? And remember, adults are the biggest influence. So it is us that's going to do this. In our classrooms, in our baby rooms, right the way through early years. But actually, if you find yourself working with older children, it's the same concept. How do we give children back joy in movement through our behaviour and through the experiences that we give our children? And I will just give you one final bit of homework before we finish. And that is simply this. You're going to have in your setting somewhere a copy of the characteristics of effective learning. And these are brilliant, by the way. The characteristics of effective learning are so spot on that every school, right the way up to universities, should be using this for learning. Why every secondary school goes, yes, these are backed up by loads of neuroscience, unambiguous evidence, these are brilliant. Throw them out the window, sit still and listen to a grown-up speak. I don't get it. Cannot understand why my children are going through hell in primary and secondary. It makes no sense. This does. But there is something missing. As you've noticed, there is a fourth characteristic of effective learning. So your homework is to find that document in your setting or your school or wherever you are and graffiti the word joy at the bottom of every copy you can find. Because without joy, all the other stuff doesn't reach its full potential. And I don't want anyone to get into trouble for doing this, so you must at least wear a disguise. I think maybe a fake beard and an eye patch when you do this, but sneak in the night if you have to. But get that word into your policy documents, because without it, children will disengage not just in movement, but in every aspect of their development. So if we can all do that, we can all bring a bit of joy into children's lives. We can actually get children moving again, even the children that haven't moved or have been restricted from movement. So on that note, we're going to leave it there. I'm going to go straight to my contact details, which you can get in touch with me anytime. I am very busy at the moment and doing back-to-back sessions like this, so it takes me a while to get back to people, but I do get back to you. So if you've got any questions at all, please get in touch. Session 2 is going to be a slightly different track. We're going to look at different parts of the brain and some actual methods that aren't the best way to work with children. For our children, they're the only way. But for now, thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions that you'd like to ask, I would be happy to answer any questions that you want to type them, or even just unmute and ask a question. I won't leave until you've all gone, but I know this is now your time and you must be exhausted. So if you've finished and you haven't any questions, you can disconnect whenever you want to, unless anybody's got any questions.
Just wanted to say a huge thank you, Ben. On behalf of the group, thank you for sharing such a lot of information there about that research and the neuroscience, and a really compelling case for that, promoting physical activity within our children. So thank you so much. We're looking forward to the next session. So colleagues, that's next Wednesday, the 17th of March, 3:30 till 5:30. So we are going to try and start at 3:30. So please do see what you can do in terms of joining us at 3:30. Look forward to seeing you then anyway. Thanks so much, Ben.